Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hey, hello, and how are you? And welcome to this latest edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, where we discuss some of the best moments, best names, and best memories in sports history. I'm Dana Augusta, your host, and I hope you're having a good day, good evening, or good night wherever you're listening. And we're back again with another show highlighting the best in sports history. And I appreciate you taking time out to listen through your busy day. And as a reminder, please subscribe to this podcast if you like what you hear here. And check out our Twitter page at HistoricallySP2 for your daily dose of sports history. Now, this upcoming Sunday is Super Bowl 56 taking place in Los Angeles between the Los Angeles Rams and the Cincinnati Bengals. And this being our Super Bowl edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, we're going to be talking to football historian and co-host of From the 55-Yard Line podcast, Mr. Greg James, as we talk about the Super Bowl histories of both the Rams and the Bengals, who have combined to compete in 6 different Super Bowls. Also on the show, instead of our top 5, we will highlight the 7 Super Bowls that have taken place in Los Angeles, including the Super Bowls in nearby Pasadena's Rose Bowl. And also, we will be sending a shout out in our final edition to a past Super Bowl MVP that took place in the City of Angels, whose perfect performance made him the first defensive back named Super Bowl Most Valuable Player. So pump up the volume, because you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, which is a proud member of the Sports History Network.
The Pigskin Tales Podcast is all about the lesser-known pro football players. Yes, there are stories about the ones we know, like Brad Tarkenton and Harold Red Grange. But have you ever heard of Ernie Nevers? How about Dave Osborne or even Grady Alderman? These men created their own path to the NFL. How did they do it? Listen to the Pigskin Tales Podcast, now streaming on your favorite music platform. Go to pigskintales.com.
Hello, guys, and welcome back to the show. I'm Dana Augusta, your host, and you're listening to the Super Bowl edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. And this week, as you all know, unless you've been living under a rock for the past week or so, we're heading into this is Super Bowl week, and this year's matchup for the big game is a matchup that not a lot of people predicted at the beginning of the year, and it came to the surprise to a lot of people. And talking about the Los Angeles Rams, second year in a row that the Rams are playing at home. The Super Bowl is played by a team playing in their home stadium, I should say. They're going to be taking on the surprising Cincinnati Bengals in their first Super Bowl since 1988. And we will be talking about the Super Bowl histories of these two teams, which has been pretty incredible if you really take into consideration that the Super Bowls that the Rams and Bengals have participated in have gone from good games to great games to legendary games in the history of the big game. And talking about that on this episode is the co-host of From the 55-Yard Line, Mr. Greg James. Greg, great to have you aboard once again, returning champ. So how things going, man, and what's going on with you these days?
I'm doing good, man. And just, dealing with winter up here in Chicago and Just kind of chilling today. It's kind of a nice, relaxing Sunday. We got the Pro Bowl on later, and yeah, life's good. I'm not complaining.
That's like better you than me in Chicago. I'm here in Atlanta, and it's cold considering we being here in the South. You know, it's in the 30s right now, which is unusual for it to be that cold and during the day. But anyway, we got a big game coming up within next week between the Rams and the Bengals in Super Bowl 56, and we were talking right before we came on, and they've been involved in some very interesting Super Bowls in the past, and hopefully this Super Bowl could live up to those games that took place in the past.
Yeah, and both teams. I mean, all these Super Bowls they've been in, none of them have been blowouts. I mean, all of the Super Bowls that we're going to talk about have been relatively close games.
Right. First one we're going to talk about, we're going to go we're going to go team by team. First, we're going to start off with the Rams. And the Rams have played in 4 Super Bowls previously to this one. And the first one took place at the end of the 1979 season when they were based in L.A. They were taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers in Super Bowl 14 in a kind of a home atmosphere because it wasn't in it was in LA proper, but it was in Pasadena, the second Super Bowl ever played in the Rose Bowl. And it was somewhat of a home game for the Rams, but you still had a lot of Steeler fans that was at that game, and the game really was a great game, as we remember.
It was surprisingly a great game because if you remember, that Rams team went in at 9-7, and up until when the Arizona Cardinals made the Super Bowl in Super Bowl 43, they were considered the worst team to ever have made the Super Bowl.
And you're right, they were 9-7. You're right about that. And then they had, it was, that team was. It was the one Rams team throughout the whole decade of the 70s that you least expected to make the Super Bowl.
Well, yeah, but back in the 70s, the Rams were always, if you look back at you look back at the standings from the 70s, the Rams were always division champions. And they were in pretty much, and I have to do my research here, but I think they were in every playoff during the 70s, and just, I can't think of a year that they weren't. But they always got to the conference championship, and they were either beaten, at some point they were either beaten by Dallas or Minnesota. So them being in the Super Bowl in 79, not that it was a shock because they weren't that great of a team, but for many it was like, oh, it's about time he got here because it just took so long for them to, actually become NFC champs.
But that year, you had the 79, which was, they had so many things going on with that team during the year from what I remember in 79. I mean, first off, you had Vince Ferragamo starting at quarterback in the Super Bowl, and he was a backup for most of the year.
Right. Because I think he replaced, if I'm not mistaken, he replaced Pat Hayden.
Yes. Because Pat Hayden had gotten hurt earlier in the year. We're right before the playoffs, and then Vince Ferragamo comes in and he pretty much leads them to an upset win over Dallas in Texas Stadium, which they never won. And then Jack Youngblood playing on a broken leg, and and it was a team that was just then you had the owner Cal Rosenblum dying in the offseason. And Georgia Frontiere becomes owner of the Rams, becoming the first female owner in pro sports history. It was a very tenuous year for that Rams team. They had a lot of drama going on with that ball club.
Yeah, and really, I mean, it was in terms of just the team itself. You had the drama, and also too, this was kind of the beginning of, in many ways, the end of the first version of the LA Rams. Because if you think it wasn't too many years later that they went down to Anaheim and played in Anaheim. And, it's in a way, I want to say it was the end of, I guess, the golden era of the Rams in the 70s, because after that, the team kind of went in, even though they went to the playoffs, they they played against the Bears in '85 in the NFC Championship. They had Eric Dickerson. The teams of the '80s weren't as good as those teams of the '70s. The teams of the '70s started off with Roman Gabriel. There's a whole list of all-stars. Roman Gabriel. I would even include Pat Hayden in there, but Jack Youngblood, Fred Dreyer, people remember him. When I look back, I think we all remember, any of us a certain age remember watching the movie Heaven Can Wait, and that was based on the LA Rams. That was when the Rams were in their heyday.
I would tell people when they first moved back to LA, I would tell people that once upon a time the Rams were on par in popularity with the Lakers. They were like the LA Lakers of football because not only because they were in Los Angeles, obviously, but they were like the NFL's glamour team for the longest time.
Yeah, they very much were. They're very Hollywood.
They were, and they had you mentioned some of the players of them. You mentioned Fred Dreyer was one of the great characters of the NFL, but you also had really great players. Isaiah Robertson was that linebacker. You had guys like Nolan Cromwell and Greg Elmendorf in the defensive backfield offense. You had Lawrence McCutcheon at running back and Wendell Tyler and Kelvin Bryant and those guys, part of that 79 squad that won the NFC Championship over Tampa Bay. And that was something of a unique NFC Championship game for the most part because you had a Rams team that wasn't expected to do much in the playoffs as you pointed out in the beginning. They struggled in the playoffs against Minnesota and against Dallas. But they played an upstart Tampa Bay team who was like a sentimental favorite to get to the Super Bowl because they had gone winless 2 years earlier.
Right. Yeah. It was. Remember that time period very well. So between like 73 and 79, the Rams won the West 7 times in a row.
Yeah.
But by the time they got to this Super Bowl, it was the worst record they ever had. But yeah, like you said, going in to play the Buccaneers, and the Buccaneers were a great team that year. And yeah, like you, I was 12 years old when that game happened, and I was rooting for the Bucs. I think the Buccaneers were the sentimental favorite. But if I think, and again, I'd have to go back and look here at the game, but if I remember, it was kind of a sloppy field that they played in, and it was a 9-0 game. Nobody scored a touchdown.
Yeah, and the Bucs had a chance. From what I remember that game, I remember watching film of that game because I was in '79. I was 5, but anyway, but I remember watching that game with them and the Bucs, and the Bucs had a touchdown late in the fourth quarter that would have got them back. That would have got them back into the game, but it was called back for a phantom illegal motion penalty. It was a long touchdown pass from Doug Williams to Jimmy Giles that was called back, and it pretty much took all of the air out of the Bucs, from that point on. And talking about Super Bowl 14, it was that game. From what I remember, again, I was 5 years old, but one of the things I remember about that game from a personal standpoint was my dad and my grandpa watching that game, and they were rooting for the Rams for different reasons. My dad was a ultimate Steeler hater because of the Immaculate Reception, because my dad's an ultimate Raider fan, and he despised the Steelers even to this day. And my grandfather, growing up in Louisiana, my grandfather was a Rams fan before the Saints came along. He was a diehard Saints fan. And looking at Super Bowl 14, people forget the Rams had the lead heading into the fourth quarter. It was something of a surprising development because you had the Steelers, who were the defending Super Bowl champs, and then you had the Rams with a backup quarterback leading and heading into the fourth quarter.
Yeah, and the Rams were leading pretty much the entire game after. But the score of Super Bowl 14 is a lot. It makes it look like it was all Steelers, but no. The Steelers won that game in the fourth quarter with 2, strikes. But before that, the Rams were leading. When the fourth quarter started, the Rams were kind of pretty much in control. And, the Steelers did what the Steelers, I think everybody expected to. But the Steelers did not dominate this game.
You remember that what broke the game over for the Steelers was the 74-yard touchdown pass from Bradshaw to Stallworth, and then they hooked up again later on in the quarter to set up that final touchdown with Franco Harris plunging it in. I tell you, on a side note, I learned a lot of NFL history through NFL films.
Yeah.
That highlight film with Super Bowl 14 has got to be one of my favorites.
Yeah, and it's to me, when I watch, you're probably the same way. I love watching the NFL films from the 70s because that, very much in a Hollywood vein that movie was. I mean, kind of the whole setting. I mean, if it weren't for the Rams, I don't think we would remember it like we do now. But even like before then, Heaven Can Wait came out, the movie, like a couple years before, and they had the Rams and the Steelers in the Super Bowl. Now, in the movie, they played it at LA Memorial Coliseum, but it was kind of interesting. Like, within a short period of time, you had real life kind of imitating art.
That's right. Exactly. Now, the Rams would eventually, everybody knows what happens. They lose Super Bowl 14. They go through the entire decade of the 80s, getting close. They got close in 85. They got close again in 1990, going back to the NFC Championship game with Jim Everett and Flipper Anderson and that group. But ended up leaving and moving to St. Louis in the mid-90s. By 1999, you get the St. Louis Rams with an unknown quarterback named Kurt Warner leading the St. Louis Rams back to the Super Bowl with an improbable season against another improbable team, the Tennessee Titans, and what a lot of people consider the greatest ending to a Super Bowl ever. Right. At least one of them. There's few that rivals that one, but as far as like sheer excitement and sheer drama, that Super Bowl, that final drive by the Titans against the Rams, and and the tackle at the 1 yard line the tackle on the 1 yard line preventing Kevin Dyson from getting into the end zone has to be one of the greatest endings to any sporting event that we've seen over the last 20 years. And it's hard to believe that game is over 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think all of us are still, and you think about it, surprised that the Titans weren't able to get it over the plane, that were that short, because that was a great game. And that would have been, I think, and I have to look at the score, but I don't. Would that game have gone into overtime? If the
Titans would have scored and hit the extra point, it would have been the first Super Bowl to go into overtime.
Yeah,
and it would have been an unbelievable, ending, to that game, because the Titans was driving down the field, and I remember there was one particular play by Steve McNair where he broke like 5 tackles and threw the ball down the field to Dyson. He must have broke about 5 or 6 tackles while in the backfield to get the ball off, and it was a completion. I think that a lot of people would have remembered that, along with the helmet catch, with the Giants in Super Bowl 42 as two of the greatest escapes by a quarterback in Super Bowl history.
Yeah, yeah, and of course that Super Bowl, it's mostly remembered as the Kurt Warner Super Bowl.
Yes. Yeah, it was. It was the Rams. From what I remember, the Rams had the lead for most of the game. It was like a 9-0 lead at the half by the Rams, and then the Titans came back, and late in the fourth quarter, Kurt Warner finds Isaac Bruce on a 70-some yard touchdown pass, to give them ultimately the lead and the game. But the game really came down to that.
Yeah, and the Rams, the Rams were in control, but it was that fourth quarter that, it goes to show you that it's not over till it's over. And, the Titans were in full gear in fourth quarter, but for just a few inches, that game, the story would have been so much different.
Yeah, exactly. That game, I remember watching it with a group of friends, and it was one of those games where it was like, what would you do in this situation? And it was like, typical Super Bowl party where everybody's like doing their own thing or whatever.
Yeah.
And then like right midway through the fourth quarter, every eye in the place was zoomed in on the television because they did not know what was going to happen next, because the game ended up being so good.
Yeah, and this was kind of the era where we started seeing the Super Bowl games being close. Now, I think the following year it was the Ravens and the Giants, and that was a blowout. But this is kind of where you start to see, we had some close games in the 90s, didn't really have a whole lot of close games in the 80s. The 70s was hit and miss. But this is the era, this is the beginning of the era when really the Super Bowl actually started living up to the hype.
Yes, exactly. That Super Bowl between them and the Titans, again, has to be one of the greatest finishes that you could possibly imagine, because it was like one of those, and then it was the final play of the game. That was what made it so great. It was like, it wasn't like a fourth down play and the Rams got the ball and they ran out the clock and anything. No, this was the last play of the game. Okay. Right. And it was just so exciting. And it just came down to that one climactic moment, and it was one of those games that you could just sit back and just relive and watch that game all over again. And you probably would get excited all over again watching that game because it was just so well played.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And, even the Rams were favored by 7. I mean, and they obviously for I'm not a gambler, but I think in gambling purposes, they hit this, they were dead on in terms of, the point spread, but that game could have gone either way. And, that's what kind of made the game special. It was like, oh, wow, we've got you were hooked up until the very end.
Now, 2 years later, the Rams were back in the Super Bowl and they were favored again, but this time against the New England Patriots and a young quarterback named Tom Brady. Now, I think they were heavily favored to win this game because, the Rams had tore through the regular season. This was the heyday of the greatest show on turf. And it was, with Marshall Faulk. I think Marshall Faulk was league MVP that year.
Yeah, they were
just a phenomenal offense to watch.
The hype up to it was very much, and I was around in Super Bowl III, but I was only 2. But I mean, they were being compared to, they were being considered one of the greatest teams of all time. Yes. And going into that Super Bowl, the Patriots were deemed to have no chance.
I remember I was a young sports reporter in Louisiana. I was right at that Super Bowl in 2001, and with 2002, January of 2002, and actually February of 2002. It was right not too long after 9/11, and it was, it was whole patriotic theme and everything. And I did some research, and they had like a totally different. They changed the logo of the Super Bowl right before that game with the American flag draped over the Super Bowl trophy. Before that, it was like this New Orleans theme because the game was in New Orleans. But it came right down to a final field goal by Adam Vinatieri. Patriots won 20-17. But the Patriots dominated the first half. They went into halftime. At one point, they were up 17. The Rams were up 17-3, and everybody thought, okay, this is when they're going to turn it on. I mean, the Patriots were up 17-3.
Right.
One play that I remember vividly was the Ty Law interception. The Ty Law pick 6 in the first half, which pretty much set the tone for the remainder of the game until the fourth quarter, and then the Rams woke up.
Yeah. Well, but they woke up. Obviously they woke up a little too late, and also too, just for. The old saying is, I don't believe in jinxes, but on this one, and I forget who said it, but on the NFL films, one of the Rams players says, "Tonight a dynasty begins."
Yeah.
And that's where things ended for him right there.
Yeah.
They didn't go back to the Super Bowl for, until they went back to LA.
Yeah. It was with that Super Bowl, from what I remember, there was the beginning of the Adam Vinatieri heroics in the Super Bowl. That was his first one where he kicked the field goal to win a game. It happened a few years later when they did it against the Panthers. But that Super Bowl, was another great game. Another notable side note about that game was the last Super Bowl that was called by Pat Summerall and John Madden.
Right.
That was the very last one that those two combined to do a Super Bowl together, which
That
was,
was
and
the
they kind of mentioned that during the last drive.
Yeah.
And it was like so subtle, and that was one of the things, I'm a big Pat Summerall fan because he's like a member of the family. Him and John Madden, listening to them pretty much my whole life. They were almost like members of the family. But that was the last Super Bowl called by those two men.
Right. Well, and it's funny, too, thinking about that. So that was the last Super Bowl called by them, but that was also the time period, and this is completely off topic but related, that Frank Caliendo's man impersonation was in its prime.
Yes.
And so the next day Caliendo goes on a radio station, and I've got the recording. I mean, the recording is out there, and he's in full Madden, and he talks about the game, and it is one of the funniest bits out there. Talking about, the DJ goes, yeah, great analysis there. And Caliendo and Mann's voice goes, yeah, and I still don't think they should have gone for it. Because if you remember, Mann was like, they should kick the field goal right here.
Yeah.
And then, they're like, oh, bad analysis. It's like, well, I mean, it was the one time where Madden, his analysis was completely off base. But then again, I think most of us were saying kick the field goal, get this thing into overtime. Because, and again, we didn't know how good Brady was back then. But, obviously, we know what happened next, and history was made. And, and they were, they pushed it. Or no, what it was. No, I take that back. Just play for overtime.
That's right.
Play for overtime. It wasn't even kicking.
It was tied. Yet. So they were just like, just go play for overtime.
Just kneel it. Kneel it, play for overtime. Instead, they went for it and got it to where they could, get, history was made, and, Tom Brady's career began then. But yeah, it was one, again, another good example of the Super Bowl living up to the hype. But yeah, the Rams were, heavily favored, and if I'm not mistaken, it was, I think the biggest margin predicted since like Super Bowl III, and we all know what happened in Super Bowl III.
Right, they were, and that from what I remember of that game, leading up to it was not whether the Rams were going to win the game or lose the game. It was like, okay, how many points are the Rams are going to win this game by?
Right. Yeah.
Because a lot of people were discounting, Belichick, he came up with an outstanding game plan in the Super Bowl 25 against the Bills when he was the defense coordinator for the Giants. He came up with a dream defense, defensive game plan against the K-gun. But what is he going to do against this?
Right.
And that was the talk. How bad was, the Super Bowl was going to be a coronation. People were saying this was going to be the biggest blowout, one of the biggest blowouts in Super Bowl history. The Patriots had a young backup quarterback in Tom Brady, who no one had heard of.
Right.
And it was like, and they weren't really supposed to be there. They lucked up and got there. They weren't supposed to beat the Steelers in the AFC Championship game. And so they ended up playing the Rams, and the Rams was basically this juggernaut, as the guy said, doing the NFL Films highlight, this is where a dynasty begins, where unfortunately he was right, but not what he expected.
Yeah, well, it was kind of the twisted irony in that he's like, he was right, it just was the wrong team, and I think even to this day he still has not lived that down.
Now, we've talked about the three previous Super Bowls with the Rams. You had the two in St. Louis, and you had the one in Los Angeles, and then they had one where they returned to Los Angeles and they played in Atlanta at Super Bowl 53, which is just 3 short years ago. And it was a great game if you like defense. This was a defense. This was a defensive game. If you look up defensive football games in the dictionary, you're going to see this game right here.
Oh yeah, and it's funny because if you just think about Super Bowls and teams and venues, the Rams and the Patriots, they're back in. Oh, that's right. You know what? I take that back. That's right. They were in it. Or were they in? Wait, were they in New Orleans for this one?
No, they were in Atlanta. They were here. They were in
Atlanta. Why was I thinking? You know what? I'm thinking. Here's my thinking, because I think I'm a little. And again, it's probably just gonna have a cup of coffee. Just talking about the Patriots for their first three Super Bowls. Their first three Super Bowls they appeared in New Orleans.
They're all in New Orleans. You're right. You were all in New Orleans.
That's what's throwing me off here. And it was like during that era. I mean, you had Atlanta. Atlanta was a host, and Atlanta was in a Super Bowl. And sometimes there's been so many Super Bowls. Sometimes my memory gets a little fuzzy on the ones in the 21st century. Because let's face it, a lot of the stadiums look alike now.
They do. You're exactly right. And this was the first Super Bowl in the brand new Mercedes-Benz Stadium downtown.
Right.
Which looks like, if you ever been to Atlanta since it's been built, it looks like it eats downtown. It's so big. But it's a beautiful, beautiful stadium. I've been in there a few times, and it's an unbelievably gorgeous stadium. But the game itself, a lot of people now, it was a game that wasn't quite as remembered for a lot of the big plays, because there was very few big plays.
There was none. There was only 3 points scored. The Rams were leading 3-0 up until the fourth quarter.
Yes. And there was the second Super Bowl that the losing team failed to score a touchdown. The first one was back in Super Bowl VI with the Cowboys and Dolphins. But, and everybody was saying, heading into this Super Bowl, is Jared Goff the next Drew Brees? I mean, next Tom Brady? Because they were setting it up that way. They were setting it up like, okay, can Jared Goff dethrone Tom Brady and win a Super Bowl and become the next great thing in the NFL? And as it turned out, not so much.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it wasn't. I mean, let's face it, the Rams, even though the Rams had such a great record going in, they were playing the Patriots. And we all knew watching that game, it's like, well, at some point, Tom Brady's going to show up. And he did.
Yeah, he did. Julian Edelman was the game's most valuable player. They won 13-3, one of the lowest Super Bowls ever. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the lowest scoring Super Bowl ever. Only 16 points between the two teams. The lowest before then was Super Bowl IX between the Steelers and Vikings. That was 16-6. But this one was, and at least in that Super Bowl, it was also in New Orleans, but it was the last game at Tulane Stadium, and they played that game in bitterly cold weather and in the rain. So it was, but in this Super Bowl with the Rams and Patriots, it was indoors for the most part. Yeah. And they had no excuse about the weather. But you had two teams, I think it was the Patriots defense frustrating Jared Goff, and everybody knows Bill Belichick's success against young quarterbacks, and Tom Brady making the plays, the big play of that game, for what I remember, was a long pass to Gronk to put the Rams to put the Patriots in position to score their only touchdown.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we think about Super Bowls. This one is the one people kind of forget of the recent Super Bowls.
Yes,
because there really was. I mean, even you and I mean, before we even came on, I had to go back and refresh my memory, because I just remembered not a whole lot happened up until, and then then the Patriots won. I mean, we've been, all of us have watched, decades worth of Super Bowls. This ranks right at the bottom of memorable ones. But, you look at the score, though, it was a close game. It was only a 7-point game.
Right. And, and then with that game, what I remember mostly, is that the Rams would get so close to getting in the field goal range, and then something would happen, either a penalty or a turnover or something like that, or just a bad read or a bad throw by Goff to put them out of range, and then they just couldn't do anything from that point on. Yeah.
I mean, the Rams were a good team, but the problem was once they got there, I mean, they faced the Patriots and they got outgamed. And, if the Rams would have played another team, would they have won? Probably. But, in this one, again, you're facing Belichick and you're facing Brady. And, usually we know how that's going to end. And it's not going to end well.
No. Now, to shift gears a little bit, the team that the Rams are going to be playing in the Super Bowl is the Cincinnati Bengals. And the Bengals had played in 2 Super Bowls, and both of those Super Bowls against the 49ers. And now they're playing another NFC West team against the Rams, but their only two Super Bowls previously was against the 49ers. And they both had Bill Walsh, who was an assistant coach for the Bengals in their early years. But a lot of people don't realize the Bengals in the 70s was a pretty good team for the first half of the decade, and then the latter half, they kind of fell into the doldrums. And then in 1981, they had a drastic uniform change, which basically changed the entire fortunes of the franchise.
And I still hate that uniform change. I like the old ones.
Me too.
I like the word Bengals on the helmet and just nothing fancy. And they changed the stripes, and it was hard for me to root for either team in that game. So, but had the Bengals, and this just goes to the fashionista in me, but had the Bengals kept their old uniform, they would have gone to the Super Bowl with or without the new uniforms. But I think that started the myth that if you change your uniforms, eventually you're going to go to the Super Bowl. And that theory kind of has played out over the years. With, I'm just thinking here when the Broncos went to the Super Bowl.
That's right.
The Buccaneers went to the Super Bowl after they got rid of the creamsicles. The Cardinals went to the Super Bowl a few years after they swapped out. So this is the game. This is the year that started the myth that new uniforms make for a better team, which, I don't think you could probably prove just by anecdotal evidence, but yeah, this was a good game, though. I mean, and also, too, this was played in Detroit. And if you've ever seen the documentaries on this Super Bowl, it's interesting because, this was back, even though game was in 82, this game had been playing out since the mid-'70s. I mean, when Detroit built that dome, so they lobbied hard to have the first cold weather game. And it turned out to be a disaster parking-wise and traffic. And I was watching on Peacock here recently a 6-part documentary on Joe Montana, and they talk about that Super Bowl, talk about the traffic, about the buses being stuck, and it was the Super Bowl in New York that they lucked out literally by a few hours with weather, but It goes to show you that having a Super Bowl in a cold weather city, like Minnesota, is a challenge, and that's why they're building all these they've built these palaces in cold weather cities with domes. Indianapolis, obviously Minnesota. Hopefully Chicago is going to build their own palace up in Arlington Heights, where I was at yesterday. But this game, I mean, weather-wise, it was a disaster. But on the inside the stadium, it was a great game. And if memory serves me correct, I think that was Madden and Summerall's first Super Bowl.
That was John Madden and Pat Summerall's very first Super Bowl airing together for CBS. Yeah. One thing, the most memorable thing about Super Bowl 16 was the goal line stand. The best goal line stand ever. To get a little quick recap of the game, the 49ers got up 20-0 in the first half. With the collection of turnovers by the Bengals. Chris Collinsworth had a fumble on the 8-yard line. Ken Anderson had a pass intercepted in the end zone in the beginning of the game. But the Bengals rallied, scored a touchdown. Ken Anderson scored on a rushing touchdown, and then the goal line stand happened. And had that goal line stand not happened, the Bengals might have won that game because they scored later on in the game. But it was like a really good game, and it was a weird aspect because the Bengals outgained the 49ers by almost 100 yards of total offense.
Yeah.
And people forget how good Ken Anderson was as a quarterback.
Yeah. Ken Anderson from Augustana College out west here in the Quad Cities should be just based on the numbers in the Hall of Fame. But because he didn't win this game, that's probably the reason why he's not in the Hall of Fame.
And the Bengals had always been like one of those sneaky good teams. Like I said in the beginning, in the early 70s, when they were still considered an expansion team, they were the first expansion team to win a division title. And only with their third season, they won the AFC Central.
Yeah, I think think, and I have to look here, but I think that was in 70.
Yes.
Because it was the rise of the expansion teams. Both the Bengals and the Dolphins
Yes.
got good real quick. And then obviously the Dolphins went to the Super Bowl in 71.
Yeah, and the Bengals, they made they won the division in 70. They made the playoffs again a couple more times in the early 70s, but they didn't win their first playoff game until the year they went to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And they ended up beating my Chargers in the AFC Championship game in the Freezer Bowl, and which I'm still bitter about that, as even watching that game when I was an 8-year-old. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But that Bengals team was really, really good. You had made the point that they had changed their uniforms and they got good all of a sudden. But I think that team would have been good anyway, because they had a perfect coach for that team, and that was Forrest Gregg.
Right. And Forrest Gregg, I mean, this was his probably best team he ever coached. And, but for 4 turnovers, they would have been champs.
That's right. I mean,
I'm looking at the stats right now. I mean, they had 24. They led in first downs. They obviously they led in passing yards. They led in let's see here. They led in passing yards, and did they lead in rushing? No, they didn't lead in rushing yards, but the rushing yards were 72 for the Bengals and 127 for the Niners. But it was the turnovers that cost them.
Right. I think back, the key turnover right at the beginning of the game when the 49ers fumbled the opening kickoff and the Bengals got it in deep in 49ers territory, and then Ken Anderson throws an ill-advised pass and intercepted in the end zone, and it just went on from there. And then Chris Collinsworth fumbled on the 8-yard line midway through the first quarter, and and the Bengals were able to move the ball on the 49ers. They just could not get it into the end zone, albeit with the turnovers. They couldn't get into the end zone until the third quarter, and then they rallied to make a game of it in the second half.
Yeah, and I mean, San Francisco didn't score a touchdown, but they got the field goals, and those 2 field goals that they made in the second half are what really made the difference.
And then you look at that team that the Bengals had. We talked about Ken Anderson. Then you had Pete Johnson, the big fullback, who was running the ball. Chris Collinsworth, Emil Harris. You had great guys on defense. Lewis Breeden, one of the Bronner brothers. They were a very, very good team all around on both sides of the ball. But the turnovers would doom any good team.
Yeah. And it goes back to, I mean, like you said, if they would have won, Ken Anderson likely would have made it to the Hall of Fame.
I think Ken Anderson deserves to be in the Hall of Fame just for the mustache alone.
Right. Well, and also the story too. I mean, he came from a small little college out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah,
and
Augustana.
Yeah, Augustana College, and but he falls into that category like with Jim Plunkett, guys who should be in the Hall of Fame that aren't, and nobody can give a reasonable explanation why they're not in the Hall of Fame.
Right. I mean, he was the one who pretty much pioneered the West Coast offense.
Right.
He pioneered the West Coast offense when Bill Walsh was an assistant under Paul Brown in the 70s, and he was the first quarterback to run that offense and ran it pretty successfully.
Yeah,
because it fit his game. It fit like the short passes, thrown out there in space, let the receiver or the back get the ball and then make their moves from there. He was a very accurate quarterback, had a decent arm strength, but it was not the type that would throw the ball deep because he really didn't need to, because that was not part of his game.
Right.
Then you have a few years later, they played the Bengals. The Bengals go back to the Super Bowl with almost a completely different team against the 49ers. And of course, people remember how that game ended with Joe Montana throwing to John Taylor. That was the Jerry Rice MVP year, when he won MVP of Super Bowl 23 in Miami. But I dare to say that maybe the Bengals were doomed before the kickoff about what happened pregame. or what happened leading up to the game is that one of their running backs was suspended and actually kicked off the team before the team even started. That was the first Super Bowl that I can remember something like that happening, where something happened pregame that caught everybody's attention and threw basically the Bengals team and mindset completely out the window.
It upset the chemistry.
It did. People who don't remember, it was Stanley Wilson. Stanley Wilson, the running back for the Bengals, was kicked off the team right before the game started for cocaine. He was caught with cocaine. He was high in a bathroom he was supposed to be in a team meeting, but one of the coaches found him in a bathroom high as a kite during the team meeting, and was subsequently kicked off the team, which pretty much upset the balance and upset the whole team. Because Stanley Wilson was a running back, and he was a key component of that Bengals offense.
Yeah, and you just even look at the score. I mean, might he have made the difference? You could argue he could.
You could argue it.
Yeah.
That was also the year with the Bengals. That was also the year with the Bengals with Ickey Woods.
Yeah.
That was the Ickey Woods year, and he became like a cult hero for it. He was like the first real NFL cult hero since the fridge. Right.
Yeah, and that team. You think of teams that they're part of that series on NFL Films has called the Missing Rings. This is one of the teams that they cover.
Because my Chargers are one of them.
And I think, and I'd have to look back, I think there was one, maybe even on the 81 Bengals too. I don't recall off the top of my head. And, but this was a great team. And this is where, but it was after this game where the Bengals, for 20 some years were pretty much irrelevant.
Yeah, that was the last really good Bengals team that a lot of people were like, ooh, they playing the Bengals this week. Ooh. And this was this iteration of the Bengals for this year, that make you think back to those Bengals teams of the 80s with Boomer Esiason and Tim McGee and Anthony Munoz and Tim Crumrye, that squad.
Yeah. Well, you just look at they had a lot of players there. Most of them are in the Hall of Fame, but players we still recognize today. Boomer Esiason, Chris Collinsworth. They're household names, obviously because of James Brooks, Anthony Munoz.
Yeah.
And, on that team, the only Hall of Famer was Munoz. But then you look at, and he had Sam Weish too. He was quite a personality as coach too. And he was also the assistant coach, and he was on the 49ers staff back in 81. So he he was Joe Montana's quarterback coach.
That's right. That's exactly right. Right. You got that Bengals team was also Sam Weish, you mentioned him, who was also a quarterback for the Bengals. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, he was one of the quarterbacks for the Bengals. But that Super Bowl, everybody remembers the John Taylor catch right at the end of the Super Bowl with 34 seconds to play. But the Bengals got the lead because of a kickoff return by Stanford Jennings, a little-known defensive back which basically shocked everybody with a kickoff return right after a 49er field goal to give the Bengals the lead. If I'm not mistaken, it gave them the lead.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look here. I don't recall how that happened. Again, it's been, we're going back, God, almost.
This is 80.
30 years ago.
Yeah. Doing that Super Bowl, I was 16. That was like one of the first Super Bowls I went to. I actually went to a Super Bowl party and watched the game at a friend's house. But I remember the kickoff return by Stanford Jennings, and I was like, oh my God, they might actually win this game,
Yeah. Well, and then again, this is kind of where, the legend of Joe Montana, he'd already won, he was already cemented as a great quarterback. This is where he became a legend.
Yeah. I was just about to ask you, do you think that this game was the one game that cemented Joe Montana's legacy and Jerry Rice's legacy for that matter?
I do, because it's the game we always talk about. Because if you look at the other Super Bowls, You look at the Super Bowl and the first Super Bowl, they won that by 7 points. There were no last minute heroics. The next Super Bowl against the Dolphins, the Niners completely dominated. Yeah. But on this one, he was cool. This is where Joe Cool, I think, will repeat with it. And I could be wrong, but if ever there was a game where this is where Joe Cool became, this was it, because he's like, I got this. And, didn't even, we've all heard the stories about, hey, look, John Candy's in the end zone.
I was just thinking about that. You're right. I was just thinking about that.
Yeah. So, and then the next year, they completely blew out the Broncos. So this was the game that cemented his status as, not so much he was going to be in the Hall of Fame without this game, but this is the one where, he's considered probably the greatest quarterback all time, at least by guys, at least for the 20th century and guys of our generation.
Yeah.
Because this is back during the rule changes too. And he took a beating when he was a quarterback.
Oh yeah. A lot of people don't realize that. And plus he was also something of a semi-scrambling quarterback as well.
Yeah. He, and that's the good thing. I don't know if you've seen it yet on Peacock, but the 6-part documentary upon his career, focuses on his college career. And I remember his college career. I remember him playing in college. I think I was 10 years old when, that first game he played in the Cotton Bowl. I remember that well.
Against University of Houston, yeah.
Yeah, and that was in the cold too. That was back, kind of like now, where you just don't know what's going to happen in Texas. It's either going to be nice or it's not going to be nice, and there's no in between. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that was the chicken soup game or not.
That was the chicken soup game.
So, but we knew he was a great quarterback, and he just cemented it with that game, because that was a great Bengals team. Again, they left him too much time on the clock. And that's really what it boiled down to.
Another play that I remember of that game was Joe Montana threw a touchdown pass to Jerry Rice in the corner of the end zone. But what I remember was the play before, when Joe Montana threw a pass over the middle to Brent Jones, the intended receiver, and Lewis Billups had a chance to intercept the pass right in the end zone. The ball was in his hands and dropped it on the goal line. And then Joe Montana throws to Jerry Rice the very next play. And I remember Dickenberg and Merlin Olsen was doing the game. And I remember Merlin Olsen distinctly saying, that could come back to haunt the Bengals, because you have to make an interception on that particular situation. And Lewis Billups, right. I want to say it was Lewis Billups. Either Lewis Billups or David Fulcher, one of those guys, one of the defensive backs, had it right in his hands and dropped it. And I was like, that could have pretty much cemented it right there. So we've seen in a number of situations where in the 2 Super Bowls that the Bengals were in, that they could have been Super Bowl champions had the ball bounced in different ways. They had chances, in both situations, and that in them winning either one of those situations, any one of those Super Bowls, they could have changed the entire course of that franchise. Because everyone knows what happens afterwards is that they went into the abyss for close to 30 years.
Yeah. And, Paul Brown died during that time period too. Right. And, Mike Brown made a lot of dumb decisions over the years, and, you hear the stories and, you read stuff, and it's like, he would have hired, he didn't do his research when he was looking for coaches, not until, years later, Marv Lewis, when he hired Marv Lewis, and unfortunately Marv Lewis never even got close to where they are now.
Right. And you think about the one thing I know about the Bengals, the one thing that would just irk me and irritate me is that they would be in big games and they would be better. The one game that I really remember is either it was a wild card game or a divisional game against the Steelers a couple of years ago, where they had the Steelers, and then thanks to a couple of dumb, unnecessary roughness, personal foul penalties, they would have beat the Steelers. And who knows what would have happened then, because that was when they had Carson Palmer and Chad Johnson and, T.J. Houshmandzadeh. They had some really good players in during the
time. They had Ocho Cinco. They had, they had some great guys.
And even before then, when they had Jeff Blake and Corey Dillon at running back, they had some really, really talented players that come through Cincinnati, but it was one of the things. It was just either the coaching or lack of discipline. That was like one of the biggest problems with the Bengals during that time of the late 90s, early 2000s was the lack of discipline.
Yeah, and they were, in their division. I mean, they had good teams in their division.
And the division didn't help with Pittsburgh and Baltimore.
I mean, not so much Cleveland, but the Browns. I mean, not so much Cleveland, but the Ravens and the Steelers were always better teams.
Right. Now, before I let you go, I got to put you on the spot. We talked about the Rams. We talked about the Bengals. Who you got and why?
I'm going with the Bengals. I just think, you know what? Joe Burrow's got a chip on his shoulder. And, I mean, I think it's going to be – hopefully it's just going to go right down to the wire. But, the last two games we've counted out the Bengals. The Bengals were not favored in the last two games, and they won.
That's right.
So I'm kind of going with, the Bengals on this one. And plus, Joe Burrow has played both games, played all season with the chip on his shoulder.
I think so. You're right. I mean, right now in the current climate of the AFC, you have so many really good quarterbacks. I mean, you got Joe Burrow, you have Justin Herbert, you have of course Mahomes, you got Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. You have a lot of really good quarterbacks in that AFC, and they're going to be batting it out for like the next decade.
And the Rams, I mean, that was not an easy game against the 49ers.
And that's a rivalry, too. Between the Rams and 49ers, that's a rivalry that dates back for like almost 1,000 years, seem like. But, that's just a bitter rivalry. And plus the city rivalry between between Los Angeles and San Francisco, too.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and the Rams did not play well. I mean, if you remember that first drive, they tossed an interception down at the goal line.
Right. And Stafford, who is a great quarterback, watched him while he was here at Georgia. He sometimes have a tendency. He has a lot of Favre in him.
Yeah,
he has a lot of Favre in him. He's a gunslinger, and he has a lot of Favre in him. And if everybody knows, Favre could throw you into a game or throw you out of one. And Stafford had to do that in Detroit. He had to. He had no choice. But here in LA, he's become a little bit more conservative. He has a lot of games under his belt. But in my personal opinion, I think that Cincinnati might end up winning this game. I really do.
Yeah, he's got more pressure to win.
He does. Burrow, he's a young quarterback. It's his second year. I mean, really. Really,
it's
his first year. I mean, because he lost most of his year last year because of an injury. But really, he's been him and Jamar Chase, from LSU. They have been setting the whole league on fire, and this might be their showcase right here.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, it's going to be hopefully just going to go right down to the wire. And
that's what I'm really rooting for.
Watch.
Also,
that's all that matters to me. It's like, okay, am I entertained?
Yeah,
really?
Or you're not entertained?
If I'm not entertained, it's much like that Super Bowl 53 with the Rams and the Patriots. None of us were really entertained. It was a close game, but none of us. But no, we've been spoiled the last few weeks with football.
Oh,
that Super Wild Card weekend, that was kind of a bust all around. But the last 2 weeks of the playoffs, we were all spoiled with some of the best football any of us have ever seen.
That's right. So what you guys got going on the from the 55-yard line?
You know what? We just had our first podcast here a few weeks ago, and we're kind of slow on kicking stuff out. I mean, between work, it's a lot of it boils down to I've just got so much going on career-wise and at home. Scott obviously is retired, but hopefully in the next few weeks we'll have something coming. I don't know what it is. I got no previews because we haven't lined anybody up, but we'd like to focus this year more. We focused on American and Canadian football both, we kind of did a whole hodgepodge of things last year. Like to try to steer more towards a Canadian game, and and we'll see how that goes. And I know I've got a bunch of life changes coming up this year, so I don't know if we're going to kick out as many as we did in 2000 in 2021. But with the USFL kind of coming on board too, I mean, that's, and we've already talked USFL history with Jeff Pearlman, and I'd like to, kind of get, folks at the USFL project. I want to have a sit down, but again, it boils down to all of us. You're like me. It's finding that time, that free time to sit down and have those conversations. And the best part is when you do find the free time, you want it to go on forever.
You're right. You're definitely right. Well, Greg, it was great to have you on board once again to talk about the Rams and the Bengals histories right before Super Bowl 56. And I want to thank you once again for coming on, man. Really do.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. You watching the Pro Bowl tonight?
I'm gonna watch a little bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't watched a Pro Bowl in years. I was explaining to somebody, I think it was yesterday, about kind of the whole history of the Pro Bowl. And now that it's back in the States, and if you remember, and we'll just to wrap this all up, I remember growing up back the Pro Bowl. When the Pro Bowl came on, it was the week after the Super Bowl, but it was kind of an event. It was on primetime TV.
Yeah, it was.
It was played in the continental U.S. Meaning, I mean, my first recollection of the Pro Bowl was in '77. Bob Greasy was actually made the Pro Bowl. I think he started for the AFC, but the AFC and NFC wore helmets that had, they didn't wear their team helmets. They wore new helmets for this.
Yeah,
or
I seen
painted
footage.
over. I remember over helmets.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, watching the Pro Bowl when it first started being played in Hawaii.
Yeah.
That was my first recollection of the Pro Bowl, which was the early '80s. And I would go back and I saw pictures of the Pro Bowl being played like in the maybe the Astrodome, and had one at the Coliseum and at another one some other places.
They played in Seattle. I remember that. I think the next year or something. Right. And so I'm hoping to actually, again, it goes back to what I said. Am I entertained? So hopefully tonight I'll be entertained by a Pro Bowl. But we've seen in past Pro Bowls where nobody tackles. I mean, it's not the game is not played. It's touch football for more or less. Right. And obviously there's a reason for that. But
that's right. You're right.
Yeah. And nobody wants to ruin their career in an exhibition game. That's understandable.
Right. Yeah.
But, I know there was a time period where they're like, we got to fix this. Nobody's watching this because nobody's playing defense. So.
Right. Yeah, and that's like that for most All-Star games that I find. The NBA All-Star game, they kind of juiced it up a little bit where the All-Stars, you have a captain of one team and a captain of another team, and you pick sides, like you did on the playground, we kind of juiced it up a little bit. And the NHL did some things to juice that up a little bit. Major League Baseball. There's so much you could do with baseball,
Yeah, and Major League Baseball, let's face it, I mean, the All-Star game is still a game. I mean, it's an exhibition game. But it's one of those games that I think all of us who grew up with it, watching it still matters.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Greg, it was once again glad to have you aboard, man, and you're welcome back at any time.
All right, buddy. Thank you. Thank you much, my friend, and we will be talking to you on the flip side here.
All right. And we'll be right back right after this short break. Hello and welcome back to the program. I'm Dana Augusta, your host, and you're locked into the Super Bowl 56 edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. And before we get on with the rest of the show, just a quick reminder that we have sponsors here, and one of our sponsors is newspapers.com. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a serious sports fan, and if you're into sports history, you definitely need to check out newspapers.com. At newspapers.com, you can get access to over 640 million pages worth of news from a variety of countries such as the United States, Canada, England, Scotland, Ireland, and so many more. Those pages actually date back to the 1700s, so that's pretty interesting. To get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com, you could do that by visiting the sportshistorynetwork.com, /newspapers. And with a paid subscription, you also be helping to support the production of this and so many other Sports History Network shows. That is, once again, sportshistorynetwork.com /newspapers. Also, you could check out our Twitter feed here at the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. And that Twitter feed is historicallysp2. And you could go there to get your daily dose of sports history. And also, you could drop us a line or two at our email address, which is historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. Once again, that email address is historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. And finally, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button wherever you hear this podcast. You know, if you like it, please subscribe, and you could get new episodes every week of this podcast. Now, usually this is the spot where we count down the top 5 sports moments from the week. But since this is Super Bowl week and this is our Super Bowl 56 edition, we're going to highlight the 7 Super Bowls that took place in the Los Angeles area. So here we go. Super Bowl I, played on January the 15th, 1967. Taking place at the historic Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, the Green Bay Packers, champions of the National Football League, took on the champs of the new American Football League, the Kansas City Chiefs. This was the first evidence of the new pro football merger agreement between the two leagues, which will finally take effect fully in the fall of 1970. Now, the game was close through most of the first half as the Packers held a slim 14-10 lead at halftime. Yet the momentum of the game changed suddenly in the beginning of the third, as Packers defensive back Willie Wood intercepted a pass from Chiefs quarterback Len Dawson and returned it to Kansas City's 10-yard line. And then from there, the Packers would dominate for the remainder of the game behind the play of Packers quarterback Bart Starr. Starr would finish the game with 250 yards passing and 2 touchdowns and was named the inaugural game's most valuable player as Green Bay cruised to a 35-10 win over Kansas City, capturing their first of back-to-back Super Bowl titles. Super Bowl VII, January 14th, 1973. The Miami Dolphins were in the Super Bowl for the second straight year, but this season Miami came in undefeated. Yet for whatever reason, they were underdogs to Washington, making their Super Bowl debut. The game taking place once again at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, the Dolphins defense controlled the game from start to finish, limiting Washington's potent offense that was led by quarterback Billy Kilmer and running of that year's most valuable player, Larry Brown. Their defense was good enough to keep Washington not only out of the end zone but off the scoreboard completely. Washington's only touchdown came on a blocked field goal and a touchdown by Mike Bass. The 2 Dolphin defenders that led the charge for the no-name defense was defensive tackle Manny Fernandez and defensive back Jake Scott, whose 2 interceptions earned him Super Bowl VII's most valuable player. More on him later in the broadcast. The Dolphins defeated the Redskins 14-7, yet side note to this game, had the Dolphins made the field goal, the score would have been 17-0 and they would have finished in 1972 with a record of 17-0. Perfection at its purest. Super Bowl XI, played on January 9th, 1977. In the first Super Bowl to be played in Pasadena's Rose Bowl, the Oakland Raiders and Minnesota Vikings were in the first Super Bowl to feature past participants that never won. The Raiders were in their second Super Bowl while the Vikings were in their fourth. After a scoreless first quarter, the Raiders dominated the second, scoring 16 points in the quarter, featuring key pass receptions to receiver Fred Biletnikoff, whose 4 receptions for 79 yards earned them the game's most valuable player honors. The Raiders' 32-14 win was the Raiders' first of 3 Super Bowl titles. Super Bowl 14 played on January 20th, 1980. In the first Super Bowl appearance by one of this year's Super Bowl participants, the Los Angeles Rams, they faced off against the defending Super Bowl champion Pittsburgh Steelers right up the road from Los Angeles in Pasadena. While the Steelers were the defending Super Bowl champs, the Rams went into the Super Bowl with a 9-7 record, the worst by any Super Bowl participant at that point. Even though on paper the game seemed to be a mismatch, it was one of the most exciting Super Bowls in the first 20 years of the big game. The Steelers won 31-19 and Terry Bradshaw claimed his second Super Bowl MVP award, but the score of the game was not a clear indication of the type of game this was. Behind backup quarterback Vince Ferragamo, who was replacing an injured Pat Hayden, the Rams made a game of it and actually led heading into the fourth quarter. But a pair of Steeler touchdowns in the final stanza and a late Jack Lambert interception sealed the deal for Pittsburgh's 4th Super Bowl win. Super Bowl 17 played on January 30th, 1980. 10 years after the Dolphins' perfect season and their win in Super Bowl VII, they were back in the big game taking on their rivals from a decade earlier, Washington. The game, while it was the climax of the season that was shortened by a player strike, saw a seesaw battle in the first half. Yet in the second half, the running of John Riggins and the blocking of Washington's offensive line, known as the Hogs, dominated the second half, and the Dolphins rushed for 166 yards and the go-ahead touchdown to give Washington their first Super Bowl title, 27-17 in the Rose Bowl. Super Bowl 21 played on January 25th, 1987. Pasadena's Rose Bowl was once again the site of 2 teams that were looking for their first Super Bowl championship. The Denver Broncos, led by John Elway, who vanquished the Cleveland Browns in the AFC Championship game thanks to the drive. They would be taking on the New York Giants, led by NFL Most Valuable Player Lawrence Taylor. The Broncos, who were in their second Super Bowl in their franchise history, were taking on the Giants, who was in their first, eyeing their first NFL title since 1956. But it was the play of New York Giant quarterback Phil Simms that supplied the Hollywood story, as he gained MVP honors in the Giants' 39-20 win. At one point in the game, Simms completed 10 consecutive passes against the Broncos defense and finished with 268 yards and 3 touchdown passes and completed an amazing 22 of 25 passes. Super Bowl 27 played on January 31st, 1993. In the most recent Super Bowl to take place in Pasadena, this was the beginning of the Cowboys dynasty of the 90s. As Dallas, coached by Jimmy Johnson, soundly defeated the Buffalo Bills 52-17. The Cowboys outscored the Bills 28-10 in the first half and never looked back. This was the Bills' 3rd consecutive Super Bowl defeat. The star of the game was a player who played his college ball in that very same stadium, and that was Troy Aikman, who finished with 273 yards, 4 touchdown passes, which was good enough to win the game's MVP award. This was the first Super Bowl win for the Cowboys since beating Denver in Super Bowl 12, and their first of 3 in the decade. And this concludes this look back at the Super Bowls that took place in the City of Angels. And coming up next, our shout out. And this episode's shout out goes to a player that was the personification of a defense that earned his famous nickname from former Cowboys coach Tom Landry. Stay tuned. And we're back with our final segment of the show, which is our weekly shout out. And this is our Super Bowl edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. And I would like to send one shout out to the first defensive back ever to be named Super Bowl Most Valuable Player. There are a total of 47 men that carry the title of Super Bowl Most Valuable Player, and some are household names while others are just household dwellers. In 1972, the Miami Dolphins had reached their second Super Bowl in a year where they didn't lose a single game. In fact, the last game that they lost was in the previous Super Bowl against the Dallas Cowboys in Super Bowl VI in New Orleans. When asked about the Dolphins' defense in preparation for that game, Cowboys coach Tom Landry said that they were a very good defense, yet I just don't know any of their names. Thus began the nickname, the no-name defense. And they were not an overly physical defense, but they just got the job done. So good, in fact, they quite nearly recorded the first shutout in Super Bowl history against Washington in Super Bowl VII. There were notable players on that defense like Hall of Famer Nick Bonaconte, also All-Pros Curtis Johnson and Manny Fernandez. But the player that was the most important on that day in the LA Coliseum was defensive back Jake Scott out of the University of Georgia. Playing cornerback opposite of the hard-hitting Dick Anderson, Scott would pick off a pair of Billy Kilmer passes in the game, including a one-handed interception that he controlled right before it hit the ground and the other to end a Washington rally, picking it off in the end zone and returning it near midfield. Scott was drafted in the 7th round by the Dolphins in 1970 and played in Miami for 6 seasons and moved on to Washington for his final 3 seasons in the league. During his 9-year career in the National Football League, he recorded 49 interceptions. He was a 5-time Pro Bowl selection and a 2-time All-Pro with a pair of Super Bowl rings and, of course, Most Valuable Player award from Super Bowl VII. In the Super Bowls that have taken place in Los Angeles, the MVP award winners were a who's who in the annals of NFL lore, with the likes of Bart Starr, Troy Aikman, Phil Simms, Fred Biletnikoff. But the name of Jake Scott is not that well known. Very fitting from a player that was a vital member of the no-name defense. And that concludes this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, actually our Super Bowl 56 edition. I'd like to thank everyone out there for listening. Have a good time watching the game on Sunday. My prediction, I think the Bengals are going to win 27-23 in a nail biter. So thank you guys for listening, and until next time, so long.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.